Thank you all for coming today. I think we're going to get started now. My name's Jonathan Zwicker. I'm the director of the Center for Japanese Studies, and it's a pleasure to welcome you today. Before I get to today's speaker, I have a couple announcements of upcoming special events for next week. We have a big concert which will be Tuesday at 7 p.m. at the Power Center, which is a taiko group from the Fukushima area, Yamagiya Taiko Ensemble, doing a tribute to Fukushima, which is, of course, this is the 5-year anniversary of the terrible tsunami, earthquake, and nuclear disaster from that area. So this should be a really wonderful event, and I urge you all to come if you're able to. On Thursday of next week at 7 p.m., also at 7 p.m. at the Stamps Auditorium, there'll be the screening of a documentary called Threshold Whispers of Fukushima, which is also about the events of 3/11 5 years ago. And then finally, at noon on Friday the 25th, there'll be a special lecture by Catherine Mazur, At Play in Atomic Japan, Kathy's Radical Kawaii Choreography of Failure. This will be in room 1636 of the School of Social Work building. That's the room we're in here now. Okay, so that's next Friday at noon. And then there are actually a number of special events going on in relation to today's noon speaker, which I'll get to in a minute. These are actually events hosted and organized by the Center for Korean Studies, and I'd like to thank the Center for Korean Studies for jointly inviting today's speaker, Aimee Lee, here today. So I actually first met Aimee in 2012, which I guess is 4 years ago. It doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but 4 years ago at a really wonderful conference and workshop at Oberlin College put on by Ann Sheriff, who is actually a graduate of U of M. Ann's idea was to do a workshop on the history of the book in East Asia, but not stopping with the book. She actually went back into the history of papermaking and had Aimee come and give a demonstration of traditional East Asian papermaking. The workshop itself was a blend of academics, researchers, practitioners, librarians, archivists, art historians, and curators. And it was a really amazing experience to see the book from all of these different angles. So at that time, 4 years ago, I had it in my head that it would be great to be able to have Aimee come up and give us a talk. And it's taken some time, but I'm very glad we finally managed it. Aimee is a paper artist, resident in Cleveland, Ohio. Her academic background is she got a BA from Oberlin College in 1999 and an MFA from Columbia College in Chicago in 2006. And then she went to Korea in 2009 on a Fulbright to study Korean papermaking. And has also done research in Japan in 2014, and that's what she'll be talking to us about today. She's had numerous exhibitions in Ohio, in Utah, in Portland, Oregon, New York State, Connecticut, even Mexico. And she's actually published and lectured and taught quite widely about the history of papermaking. I'd like to single out one publication in particular, which was her 2012 book, Hanji. Hanji is Korean paper, like washi is Japanese paper. Hanji Unfurled, One Journey into Korean Papermaking, which was actually published here in Ann Arbor. Now, over the course of the weekend, or beginning today, she'll be doing a number of other public events. This evening, she'll be in Detroit at Signal Return, which I'm given to understand is a letterpress in Detroit, giving a talk from East Asia to the Great Lakes, Korean paper at home and abroad. And then over the weekend, she'll be at UMA here on campus, the University of Michigan Museum of Art. In the morning on Saturday, she'll be giving a talk from 11 to 1, the history and creative applications of Hanji, which will be in the multipurpose room at UMA. And then at 3 to 4:30, she'll be doing Hanji Art for All Ages, which I'm assuming is a hands-on workshop for kids or families, anybody. And then a similar workshop at the DIA, the Detroit Institute of Arts, on Sunday from 2 to 4. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Aimee Lee.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to the Center for Japanese Studies and also to the Nam Center for having me here. It's a great honor, and I'm really excited to be able to talk about this research in particular because because I am a Korean papermaking specialist, people usually don't ask me to do these talks, but in fact, their histories are so intertwined. And especially with the papermaking. Papermaking was invented in China, went to Korea, was taken to Japan in 610 through Buddhism. And so there's no way to study Korean papermaking without also investing deeply in Japanese papermaking. So this research is, what I'm going to try to show you is actually just a smattering of papermakers that I met in Japan, and I was not interested so much in learning about Japanese papermaking or how to do it, which was something I was already aware of, but how people come to Japanese papermaking and how they decide to stay a papermaker, and how that you'll see actually it's almost a half and half balance. Of the people I met, it's half Japanese and then half foreign nationals. So this first papermaker, he's so amazing. I traveled mostly. I was mostly in the Tokyo area and then Niigata. So in Niigata, in this tiny town called Kadoide, I met Yasuo Kobayashi, and he's just over 60 now. He's in his 60s, and he is the kind of like the godfather of Japanese papermaking, not only in that region but also around the country. He has an interesting background where he was born into a papermaking family but did spend time living in Tokyo. He's a philosopher. He wrote a couple books. He thinks very differently from most papermakers. And so you can see he's set up a studio, a paper mill in this very rural area. And this was right before I had visited in November, and that's when they have their Kozo Harvest. Kozo is the name for the paper mulberry tree, and that's used for the majority of Japanese papermaking. Also in Korea, that's the same tree that's used there. And he cultivates his own, and he has several fields, and so they were done with their harvest, but he had intentionally left some trees standing for my visit so he could show me how he harvests. So this is him sharpening his little sickle, because it's all done very manually by hand. And I'm gonna see if so this is just you can see they're very neat rows, and he should just be able to get it with one cut. And then he's gonna sort, which ones. The little twigs you just get rid of. The bigger ones he'll sort, check, make sure they're straight. And it was raining this day, so that's why he's wearing that hat. Up further on the hill, he had baby Kozo that he was just starting. And so this is really important to him to be able to work from the very root on up to make this paper. He has since he said when I met him, he was giving his business over to his eldest son, who was 28 at the time, so he's about 30 now. And he said that's Japanese tradition. And I'll take questions at the end. Those 1 year. So 1 year growth, every year you cut down the kozo, you don't kill the plant. It's very good. It's coppicing, essentially. It's the way that it's been done in East Asia for almost 2,000 years, and it's a very sustainable way of functioning. And so his son, they then have to transport, bundle, transport, and then his son is marked with chalk the lengths that they need, because they need to then steam this. They need to cut it down, they have to steam it, and then strip it to get to the bark that you need to make the paper. And so we talk about washi a lot, and when I met him, I said, what are your concerns about the future of washi? And he said, well, we have to start all the way from the beginning and talk about washi as a term and how it's not a great term to be using. So we talked about, so you can see these are the bundles that his son's working with. And he was talking about how washi actually was a term that the Japanese, and I don't know who was in charge of this, but during the Meiji Restoration, that's when they decided to use this term. And he said it got very confusing because about the, machine-made paper was coming in at the time. So then it wasn't enough to say washi, they were saying teski washi, and then they weren't sure then about where it was made, and so then it became dento teski washi. And besides the fact that people didn't even know what washi was, he said when he was growing up, that's not, they would see it in the textbooks, but he grew up hearing kigami, and so he and his friends would be like, is washi kigami, and what's the difference? And this is very confusing. And so he talks about how kigami is the preferred term that he uses because it talks about ki to be it's about being alive, to be born, about breathing, which paper breathes, and kami, which is the name for paper. And so he said, if we keep calling it washi, we aren't even getting to the heart of what it really is. And so this is the process. He is not urinating he's using a hose. But this is an unfortunate shot. It's a steamer, so you can see it's wood-fired, and then all those bundles that are trimmed go into this steamer. So it's already been steamed. He's now just cooling it down with cold water so that he can then take the bundles out without burning themselves. And then you can see the cores, the yellow cores are on the left, and the strip bark is on the right. So that you can only do after steaming to separate those two. And then there's a whole process after that of scraping the outer bark from the inner bark, and then cooking it in alkaline solution, and then rinsing, and then picking out any other impurities, and then beating it, and then creating your mucilage. And after all of that, then you can get to this point where you're at the vat. And the great thing about what Mr. Kobayashi was doing is that he figured out, you notice she's making 18 sheets of paper at once. The top frame is made so that she makes all these squares, and she's doing multiple dips. This creates a laminated sheet that's very strong. And the purpose is for sake labels. So Mr. Kobayashi realized even early on, how are we going to make a living just making paper? No one's going to want to buy it in the quantity that could provide for my employees. So he approached the liquor manufacturers, and so they have contracts with Asahi for doing high-end, like I guess Kubota is top-shelf sake, for doing the labels for the top-shelf sake so that consumers can come in and they know, oh, it's a handmade label. This is why I'm paying this much money for it. This is the good stuff. And so she's transferring the paper off of the screen so that she can keep working. And so this continues, and he was able to create this market, and then to the point where he has 15 employees, and he actually has 2 separate mills. And this is incredible for this region, to be able to have this many people making a living. So I didn't get to talk to these young paper makers because they're working. I don't know how they had an entire tour group that heard all the noises, but this I wanted to show you that's large sheet formation. So similar, but different in terms of what they're trying to get for end product. Sake labels, and you can double up to 5. You usually go 200 dips a day. In the end, you're going to end up making 1,800 sake labels in a day. If they manufacture like 3 million bottles, I forget how many a month. Anyway, it's enough to keep them busy. I think 70% of their income comes from these sake labels. And the Asahi is not that far from where the main brewing and bottling plant is not that far from there. So if you go there, you can go on a tour and see all the bottles and the assembly line, and then there's this closed room that you cannot look into because they have worked for many years with the paper makers and the printers and the label affixers to figure out how to get the labels onto the bottles mechanically. And they're the only company that can do that. All the other companies that have since tried to imitate this handmade paper thing or like tear the edges to make it look like a handmade paper, they have to do it by hand, which slows down production. But so that area, whatever special adhesives or anything, people can't see. And then of course he has this beautiful shop that set up to sell his paper, but also, stationery and other kinds of goods made out of paper. They specialize in Niigata in snow bleached paper. So to get a white paper, instead of just doing sun bleaching, which is traditional across East Asia, they get so much snow they actually will lay out, so that stripped, the white bark, they'll lay it out in the snow and then put a big tall stick in there and then just leave it for the season. And the snow, they have to have the stick because it's going to get snowed on and you have to find the kozo later. But apparently the melting of the snow causes ozone, and that does further bleaching, and also the refraction of all the sunlight against the snow causes it to be bleached more. And I have samples of all of this so that you can see the difference between a snow bleached versus just a regular sheet of paper. They also provide these kinds of workshops for people who come through. And when I was there, it was a group of 12 Israelis visiting, and I'll talk more about why that happened. But he's very devoted to supporting not necessarily traditional papermaking, but he just, I could go, this whole lecture could be about him, but he talked about when he first started making paper, in his 20s, it was all just for ego, just like the paper that would bolster his ego. And in his 30s, he made paper that he thought his customers would like. In his 40s, he made paper that was white bleached, again, because it was good for the market. And then when he got to his 50s, he realized that I'm working completely wrong. I'm not supposed to impose myself on the kozo. I'm supposed to ask the kozo what it wants to become and then help it become the paper it wants to be. And so that's his goal now. That's his interest. He can indulge that because he is no longer, his son is in charge of the business now. And he said there's a difference between making paper and growing paper. And I'm interested in cultivating. And so he talks a lot about, and forgive me, I'm not a Japanese specialist, but he talked about bunka. So culture, which he said comes from the heart, and bunmei, which is civilization, which is all about progress, and how he works from the heart because paper is very inconvenient and does not like to go. Paper and progress don't really get along. And so he talks about when his father and grandfather had very similar lives, and he and his father had similar lives. He and his son, he said, their lives have become so different that it's very difficult to bridge that rift because of how quickly everything is changing technologically and the way that people communicate and interact with each other and with nature and materials. So, he said there are plenty of people who work kind of in that bunmei style progress. How can we mechanize a paper making? How can we, bleach it chemically? How can we do that? And he said that's fine. They can do that. I'm here to balance the equation by working in this other way. And he's also, when I talked to him about how, he was born into it. There was a time where he went away and then he came back because he felt it was important to teach. And so a lot of people in that region were all taught by him. But he talks about how, I said, how do you choose your apprentices? Because, people must come to you and you must have to go through some kind of selection process. And he said, again, and forgive me, so hitsuzen is the inevitable. It's talking about fate. And then guzen is the accidental, the coincidence. He said, there is no coincidence when someone comes to me and says they want to study with me. It is not, I don't have a choice. It's not my job to choose people. It's my job to go with fate. So I never say no to people. He said, maybe at this age, I just say no because it's inconvenient for my family, but I've never turned anyone away. He said he once had a paper, someone who ran a paper shop in Kyoto who called and said, I have someone who wants to study with you, and he didn't know who this person was or their name or background, and he just said, yes, just send them. And so he really believes that that's how sensei and deshi meet, and it's not about, going through the resume and everything. And so, of course, things have changed in Japan, and so not a lot of people want to be paper makers, but he has, of course, all these samples and samples and samples. He's done so much research of paper, not just his, but historical. This is all shifu, which is paper cloth. Japan has a very special tradition of taking paper and spinning it into thread and weaving it on a loom and making cloth. And I have samples here. It's purported that ninja who were trying to send secret messages would write the message on the paper, cut it into a single piece of thread. They would spin it, they weave it, make clothing, clothe a messenger, put him on a horse, send him away. The receiving people would take his clothing off, and they would unravel it, and they would unwind all the little strands. And then because of the way that you make it, you can tell where the top and bottom of the sheet are and reconstruct the message. And they have similar stories in Korea about being able to do this. And then I had the privilege of being able to give a talk to the group of Israelis and to him, and talking about Korean weaving traditions, and he was showing me again the way that they do it in Japan. And so this is one night in the countryside, and you can see up there the bald man at the beer, that's Itzar Newman, and he is the person I'm going to talk about next, because he and Kobayashi-san are very, very close. And so Itzar is from Israel, and he went to Japan in 1983 for the first time. He studied for half a year in Mino, which is a very famous papermaking village. As some of you know, Mino paper has become a UNESCO World Heritage. And then went to Kadoide and studied for a year with Mr. Kobayashi. And he was so moved by the entire process that he went back to Japan and started an entire Japanese-style paper mill in Israel, to the point of legally bringing 10 root cuttings cleaned of Kozo from Japan, shipping it above board, getting it quarantined in Israel. 7 of them survived. They were all wrapped in sponges, and he now has 300 plants. So he grows all of his own Kozo. He makes his own washi, or kigami, or paper, or whatever he calls it. But here he is, because he's been through this process, he's helping the women who do all this stripping of the steam bark. He's showing this tour group the process of drying. That's a heated steel plate. And so he figured out, he doesn't have a lot of money. How can he needs to come back to Japan. He wants to come back on a regular basis, to the point where, he'll rent a house in Kadoide and stay for a while and bring his whole family. And he figured out he could do that if he became a tour guide. But it wasn't just any kind of this. He refused to go into kind of commercial tour business, because he was going to be the guide. He was like, I don't want to do the same thing every time. It's different every time. I have to be interested in it. And it's not your usual, like, one night in Tokyo, and then we're going to go to Kyoto, and then we're going to, 4 nights in Kadoide. Activities include hiking in the rain, seeing a local performance, and spending a lot of time at this paper mill. So he manages every year, or even twice a year, to gather this group of 12 Israelis, and it's a different group, and there are people who become so attached to this kind of travel that they come multiple times on these trips, because they know it'll always be different, and every time he meets new Japanese people who are willing to help. And so he screens them very carefully. He has them all meet as a group before they go, to prevent any kind of weird, if any of you, we've all been in weird group dynamics and you're trapped with these people. So he wants it to be a good experience for everyone. And they even gather afterwards, because they become so close. And the night that I arrived, there was one woman reading a Hebrew translation of a Japanese poet. And so they get very, very, they have this amazing experience that's, for me, it was really, it was interesting to meet these people, and I've become friends with a couple. So this is actually Itzar showing Iwano Ichibe, who is the national treasure for making paper in Japan. He's showing him one of his pieces of paper to inspect for approval. And so that was in the village of Echizen, which is, I think, now called Fukui. And that is also another very famous papermaking center. And then this is Itzar with his kozo. You can see that it grows really well. And this is his New Year's card. And he's invited me. I haven't been able to figure out a way to get to Israel, but he's invited me to help with this harvest. And then this is wonderful full circle. He goes to Japan a lot. Mr. Kobayashi does not get to come a lot, and he made the trip last year. And so he's squatting, taking pictures of the Kozo that he had provided so many years ago. And so one more thing about Itzar, he also has trained deshi. So I actually met a Czech man who flew to Cleveland to take a 2-day workshop with me to learn Korean paper making because he was a photographer and he wanted to print his photos on handmade paper, but he thought it would be better if he could make it himself. And then after 2 days with me, he said, this is way too hard. I'm just going to find a good supplier. He actually ended up studying also with Itzar a little, and he set up a paper mill to make Japanese-style paper, so he is still doing that. The other deshi that Itzar has is Michal from, I think, also from the Czech Republic, and he was a banker with Citibank and very successful. And I don't even know exactly how he got into papermaking. There's a wonderful video online actually about his mill. He decided to just give it all up. So he's actually in his, I want to say, his early 30s. He had a son, and he realized, I'm never going to see him grow up. This kind of life I'm living, and he's not going to have the kind of life I want him to have as a child. So he bought a house in the countryside. He moved with his wife. They set up a paper mill. And because he's so smart business-wise, he's gotten all these contracts. He has all his contacts from Citibank. He worked with a steel manufacturing company to make certificates for people using steel dust in the paper. And so he's doing quite well. And he said that the people that he used to work with at the bank, when they see him, they won't even talk to him because they're still in their suits and ties, and he knows that they're so unhappy and they're so mad at him for leaving and showing that it's possible to be more content. And so talking again about foreigners, Richard Flavin is the elder statesman really of Japanese papermaking, and he is so traditional in the way that he makes it. He also grows his own kozo and harvests and everything, to the point where Japanese people say that he makes paper that is more Japanese than actual natural-born Japanese. He was drafted during the Vietnam War, and he was so delighted when they said he was going to Korea. So he was in Korea for about 1.5 or 2 years, and in the process he met a printer, and he was learning all these printmaking techniques, and he was originally from Boston, had studied design, and he just loved some of these techniques. And they said, there's someone in Japan I could introduce you to, and he made this trip there, and he just fell in love with everything about the culture and the aesthetic. And so he went back to Boston and then, got money so he could go back, and he's just never looked back. So he's been in Japan for over 40 years. His first wife was Japanese, and after she passed away, he remarried. And his current wife, Ryoko Haraguchi, is also an amazing textile clothing designer who has her own gallery in Tokyo. And so actually the scarf this is one of hers, and so it's all indigo dyed, and this is actually one of her rejects. She said this is not good enough for actual sale, but she let me buy it for a discount. But they make a really wonderful team. This piece of paper, a huge piece of paper, has been embossed with these wood blocks, and he'll use the wood blocks, and then she'll use it also to print on her textiles. And so they're in this building in Tokyo, and then he also has a place out in Ogose, which is about 2 hours for him to get there, where it's just like not insulated and really cold, and it's his studio. He also, he used to have in Ogawa, he studied actually in Ogawa Machi. They had this hands-on training center where foreigners and Japanese could learn how to make paper, and that's where he met Timothy Barrett, who some of you may know as kind of the American godfather of bringing Japanese paper, making awareness to the U.S. He is a professor at the University of Iowa, directs their Center for the Book, was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, I want to say in 2009. And he makes, again, in that tradition of making paper that's so close to the Japanese tradition, excellent conservation paper, to the point that the Declaration of Independence is actually backed with paper for the University of Iowa to keep it from crumbling, right? So he and Tim so Richard and Tim were in Ogawamachi at the same time, and then Richard found this amazing Zen temple there where the keeper of the temple wasn't there a lot, the monk, and so they figured out an agreement like, I won't pay rent, but I'll take care of the place for you, and then and in return I can just do whatever I want here. He was growing kozo, setting up a mill, all these, apprentices of especially Americans or people who spoke English who didn't know Japanese, because they could learn from him and they could have this direct experience. So unfortunately, in 2005, there was a terrible fire. It was a wooden structure, and the entire thing was gone. So all kinds of records, and Paul Denhode, who we'll talk about later, all of that lost in the fire, all this research. But he rebuilt Nogose, and it's not as great soil-wise, but it's next to really fresh, clean mountain spring water. So that is really key to making excellent paper of any type. And so this is Richard with his wife, and you can see that paper. He does beautiful you'll see the sculptural part, but that's paper that he's dyed, and then he's used metal saw pieces to do this frottage technique. So he is now in his 70s. He's not physically well enough to be doing a lot of that hard labor. This is some of his kozo, though, and he still does a little bit every year, enough to make some paper for his artwork. And then what he does now is a lot of this relief casting. So he uses, some of you might recognize the little mochi, the rice cake, the wood blocks that you use to make the shapes. And so he loves antiquing, so he finds his stuff everywhere, and then he uses it he rips up tiny pieces of paper, tamps it in. He uses a little bit of methyl cellulose, I think, and then he does several layers of this, and then you get, this beautiful texture, and then you can get these wonderful shapes. And he will teach workshops in this, because this he can handle. So he's in Tokyo kind of the middle of the week to help his wife, and then on the long weekends he's out at his own studio. He also found these wonderful woodblock prints for kites. As you also know, paper was used for kites in Japan and Korea. And the other thing that he found, and I have up here, in the description of this lecture, we talked about World War II paper bombs, and so the Japanese pressed into service paper makers to make all this paper to create hot air balloons laden with bombs that were floated on the jet stream to attack America. And so, and it actually worked to some extent, not to the extent they wanted. They only managed to kill a family of 5 in, I want to say, Washington or Oregon, where, a kid saw something and just pulled on it and it detonated the bomb. And so those are the only casualties on American soil from World War II. But I said he antiques a lot. This, he said, when he found it, it was a whole batch. He said, I'm taking that whole batch. That is the paper. He knew it because he knew the dimensions. It's this weird square dimension. This is not usually the way that it's made. It's a little bit, there's a little bit of insect, damage, but because, again, this paper is so strong that it would be able to handle that trip across the ocean. So Paul Denhode was one of his, they wouldn't call each other apprentice, but Paul went to Richard to do a lot of research, and he also did a lot of research on his own. So Paul is actually from Toronto. He got his graduate certificate at the Center for Book Art in Iowa, so he studied with Tim Barrett, and then he got his MFA in graphic design as well in Iowa. And he had made this trip to Japan. He met all these people who were kind of the forefront of the hand papermaking revival in America, and was encouraged to do more study in Japan. And so he got a scholarship in 2001 to go to Japan, and he's just never been back. So he married a Japanese woman. They had a daughter a couple years ago. And so Paul has also really, so meticulous, his research. And he has studied with one of the great masters in Shimane Prefecture, Abe-san, and he he did the whole thing where you only, the first visit you don't even say you want to study with them, and then the second visit you just kind of make sure they're comfortable with you, and then the third visit, okay, maybe we can talk about this. And so he spent some time studying there. He's also, this is, I think, I'm pretty sure these are images from when he worked at Oguniwashi, which I'll talk about a little later, making those sake labels. So he spent a lot of time with Imai-san, and they also forged this really great kind of brotherly relationship as people trying to promote this kind of paper making. And so he is a great resource, again, because he's fluent in both languages. Everything Tim needs for Iowa, Paul sources. Paul sources all the fiber. Paul sources, when Oberlin wanted to get a sugeta, so the tool used for making paper, go to Paul for everything. And right now, unfortunately, he's living in Tokyo and, raising his family and teaching at a school, so he can't be hands-on paper making, but he is an amazing resource, and sometime will come occasionally, see his family in Toronto and to teach a little bit. So this is him with Honma-san, and this is the process. He was very invested in trying to learn from me the process of weaving paper the Korean way, because he's been trying for over 10 years to find someone in Japan who does this, and he hasn't found anyone. This is the proprietor of Oguniwashi. So Paul, this is where Paul worked. And so he wasn't necessarily apprenticing, he was actually an employee, but he helped them figure out how do you market to a Western audience. He did a lot of translations for them, designing things like, why don't we have a line of paper meant for cutting out snowflakes, and then we can have these instructions for doing that, and so on and so forth. And so he also helped a lot with their Kozo field. So Imai-san is a younger paper maker. When he's from the area. He married into an Oguni family who they had been paper makers, but there was a break in the lineage, and then his wife and mother-in-law went back and studied with Mr. Kobayashi to learn it. And then he was an electrician, but he knew he wanted to have a family business, so he decided that he would also learn how to make paper and run a mill. And also, there weren't as many men doing this work, so it was welcome in some ways in terms of some of the heavy lifting. And so he's actually at Nagaoka City Hall. This is all paper that his mill has made. And so it's a new building. Kengo Kumi was the architect on it. And it is mostly glass, but there's this entire section, and it's all native grown kozo, all snow bleached paper. I believe he said took 3,500 sheets of paper, about 25 by 36 inches, so about 2 by 3 feet, all coated with konnyaku, which is a natural starch. And then it took 2 years of his Kozo Harvest to make that. So he is the one. He has this amazing field that he cleaned up. It went from 5,000 to 3,000 trees. He wanted the rows wide enough to run a tractor through to be able to turn the soil. He gave me such good advice about fertilizing and care of the plants, that we had a really bad crop in Cleveland where we grow our own kozo, which is actually from Japan as well. But the advice was so good that the following year, after following those directions, we ended up with an amazing, amazing crop. So you can see how big these can get. These trees can get very, very big. And he uses this is for Tororo. I can't remember the plant, the actual plant, but it's related to hibiscus, and it's for neri, which is the mucilage used for Asian paper making, and they use all that rather than synthetic, which is what a lot of, like the workshop I'm teaching tomorrow for RC, we're using synthetic because it's easier. But so he has that all frozen. You can see they do the sake labels as well. Again, 70% of his income from sake labels. You can see the drying sheet is so clogged with fibers from this shape. And those are those labels for because he took us to the store to show them off. And then he also see the paper wrapping the sweets. They manufacture that. So there are all kinds of ways that papermakers need to find these niches to be able to make a living. He is still, he's, you know, still, he said, I said, are you worried about the future of papermaking? He said, well, I'm not worried. But that region, they had a terrible earthquake 10 years ago, and so a lot of people left. And so to combat the depopulation, the government had been giving all these incentives and grants for people to return, and they had a whole program of internships where you'd live there for a year, you'd work with him farming, because traditionally papermakers are farmers, farming during the summer and making paper during the winter. And he said it was a great program, but I wish the screening process was better because nobody stayed. You know, it was like a nice experience for young people to have for a year that was fully paid. He was not compensated, but in the end, he was like, it was so much work to train them just for them to leave. Though there are a lot of stories of people who eventually come back, but then when we go into the city, we go into Tokyo. This is Chia Honma. She's actually, I don't know her married name, but people know her because she married after she started papermaking. So a lot of people know her as Honma-san, but she studied with Shinichiro Abe, who is a master Mitsumata papermaker in Shimane Province Prefecture, and she is the one who, in her 20s, didn't know anything about, you know, handmade paper, and was working with all, you know, machine-made stuff in her job. And then a friend of hers sent her a letter on washi, and she was just so captivated by the texture and the softness, and she just decided, I want to learn more about this. And she was doing research, and she just realized, I want to learn how to make it. She went through this whole process of going all the way out to Shimane without an appointment, which is not the way you're supposed to do it, and just saying, I just want to meet him. And they figured out, okay, come, you know, we'll figure it out. And she was there for 2 years, and she studied with him. She also studied in Suwano and Yamaguchi. I actually think she may have been not just studying, but working. So she then worked and gained this experience. And she said, my case is so rare. Usually you stay with one teacher and you work at that mill forever, but there were no spots there because it was a family business. Or you set up shop in that area. But she ended up working in a lot of different places, going back to Tokyo only because her grandmother passed away, and her parents said, you know, do you want to take her house and convert it? And her father helped her convert it. I have that piece. I asked her what she does, those inner pieces of the Kozo tree. You can't use for paper, so you use often for firewood. And I saw her stash, and I said, what do you do with those? And she makes the paper dusters with them. So, but you can see outside she has a little garden. That's not where she does her crops. She has a whole other plot of land where she and another person grow Mitsumata and Kozo. She was able to get the vats either through purchase. Her father did a lot of carpentry. They ripped out the floors in this area, ripped out walls, acquired everything she needed or built everything she needed, and it's all just for one. She just works alone. These are these old drying boards, often used. They were often used, I think, for kimono stenciling or making kimonos. And so you can see just one of everything. And she's converted the other side of the first floor into a shop. So again, you need to be able to make a living selling. And so the big wooden vat is actually, it's an old traditional papermaking vat, and she just has converted it to sell pieces. And this is a kimono she's made out of paper. And that is a tradition also of making this kind of clothing out of the sheets of paper, not turning it into cloth. And so she's very, very determined. She said she still doesn't make enough to break even. I believe that her family, her husband, provides for her. But she was there. We met her. She had her little baby on her. And we were talking, and he fell asleep, and she put him down. But she has pictures of him on her back while she's making paper, as big as the video of the man you saw earlier. And then the final person I wanted to mention is Ayako Yoshizumi, who is over 80, and she is a school teacher, but she is in Setagaya in Tokyo, and she is at this elementary school, and you can see all this paper that the students have made. That's the cafeteria windows. So they have this paper making studio that's like the envy. I see grad programs that don't have studios this good. This is for elementary school students. custom made, slate floors, metal vats. They have kids come through and she has every year 600 kids make their own diplomas to graduate. And she does that. They have all, hundreds of tools. They watermark with the logo of the school, and then you can see how that makes a watermark. And she's been teaching for 26, 28 years now. She's retired but still does some part-time teaching, and she just got into papermaking. There was a course apparently in Japan that adults could go, and it was like, weekend intensives, and you would go to one place and learn different parts of the papermaking. And so from that, she was able to there was apparently a position at the school to teach this, and she's developed, of course, the program more and more. She's the one who was able to get the funding to build out this entire classroom. They grow Kozo outside as an educational tool, even though they get their Kozo from Ogawa. They collect old milk cartons, soak them in water. You take off the outer kind of waxy cover, and the inner is totally fine for pulping and making more paper. And then in their newly designed bathrooms, you can see the male and female, even the bathrooms, they display all the work by the students. And so to her, it's really important to start really young. These are drawing boards, again, from Iwano Ichibe, National Treasure, that he gifted to her. They're I think, 150-year-old ginkgo boards. And then she also teaches to the community, so senior citizens and other people in the community, these classes. This is kinkarakami. It's a very endangered craft. I think there's maybe like one guy left in Japan who's spent this time trying to figure out how it was done. It's a way of taking paper and then hammering it around this wood embossed, a wood block that's carved. It's usually round, and then applying gold leaf or applying some kind of foil, and then usually what we think is gold leaf is usually some kind of tin, and then you coat it with a transparent something that comes from seaweed or other kind of plant stuff that's yellow, so that gives it that gold tint. And the back of it is all coated with persimmon dye, so it makes a really strong sheet. And it was meant to be wallpaper, and it was mimicking these very lavish European wallpapers. So it was for the European market, but it's very rarely done now. And so she keeps these traditions alive. She has all kinds of projects she does in the community to try to have the storefronts use, I've forgotten now, in the doorways, noren that she had a whole project where for I think a week they all had paper noren, and it rained and everything, so that people could see how it withstands the elements. And so she's still very active. And so this was a gift that she had given me. So that's the inner core of the Kozo stick. The paper streamers are like that gohei that usually are on the Shimanawa. Yeah, and then the pine needles, and then the circle is a braided, twisted, the actual bark that's stripped from it. And so that's a link. If you just look up American Folklore Society and look for the I think it's professional development program, I wrote an entire report. So there are more people and there are more pictures, more of the backstory. So you can find that report. It's available for free as a PDF online, and the bibliography and everything. So you can, if you want to look up the actual their websites and things like that. But it's something that is definitely, when I compare it to my research in Korea, Japanese papermaking is a little healthier, but it's still not anywhere in a place where we can say, okay, we're done, and it's fine as it is. So what I want to do, actually, I can't take the mic, but okay. Yes.
Does the same thing go on in China? You said there was an issue on Chinese paper.
Oh, China is a whole other ball game. I mean, there is a very old tradition. It's just tricky because you're dealing with such a large area, and also the paper culture was slightly different. In Japan and Korea, you have a very, very deep, active paper culture where like everything was they had made so many things out of paper, whereas I think in China they were more interested in using it for communicating, for the writing and the But again, not a lot of research has been done, at least in English, on Chinese papermaking. So I can't really say for sure. But in the way that I've seen, and also, I mean, there are biases. People think that Chinese paper is not of very good quality. There is definitely good Chinese paper, but there's also a huge tradition of bamboo paper making there, which is very different from Japan and Korea because of the natural resources they had. And it's a whole different process of Korea is similar to Japan in terms of I mean, it was a Korean monk who was, so similar in terms of the raw materials, in terms of the way that it's processed, similar in terms of the way that it's formed. There is a very big difference in sheet formation, and then during the occupation, the Japanese forced Korean papermakers to switch to Japanese style because it was more efficient, even though it made a different kind of paper. So there's that difference, and you actually see that influence. It's very pervasive, not just East Asia, but all of Asia. Any of the Asian countries that are, like Vietnam and Thailand and Taiwan and China and Korea, they're all, for the most part, the handmade paper making industry is doing what we think of as Japanese style paper making. So a lot of the kind of variations in cultural, in the culture and how it was done, a lot of that has been lost. No, well, I don't know, because I mean it is more efficient. It's absolutely like you could make 2 to 4 times as much paper Japanese style than Korean style, but it's just a matter of, and in the direction they were moving at the time, it was like, oh, let's westernize and become modern, and so who cares about this stuff? Let's do that as fast as we can. Yeah. Kozo, it's very. Yeah, I mean, so Kozo, the fiber is, you're using the bast fiber, so it's the stem or the bark fiber, whereas bamboo is a grass fiber, but it's a woody grass. So the grass fibers are much shorter. If you get it all the way down to the microscopic level, the smallest, version of it would be a much shorter fiber than Kozo. Kozo has the longest fiber length of any of the paper making materials, and so it's very strong in terms of like wet strength and tearing strength, and that I teach, and what I'm going to do this visit, I teach this method of just getting the paper damp and then crumpling it up and just massaging it, and it doesn't cause it to fall apart, whereas with short fibered papers it tears, you get holes. Kozo, that bark is so strong. I think in Korea they had one of those kind of reality TV things where they were able to tow a car with the bark uncooked, before you cook it, to soften it, take out any acid. It's really, really tough fiber, and so it makes a really strong sheet of paper. It grows very well in kind of any climate. It doesn't need a lot of soil. It's really good for soil erosion. It grows on mountainsides really well. And it, so, a lot of the fiber we get for paper making for students here is from Thailand, because it just grows year round and it's huge and it's cheap. But in Japan and Korea, where you have these season, huge difference, fluctuations from winter to summer, that causes the tree, it'll be smaller than the ones in Thailand, but it will be much stronger because it's suffered through and survived these kind of extremes of climates, and it gives you much finer fiber. And so if you just let it go and don't coppice, it'll start looking like a tree as we know trees, like lumber. But usually you coppice and they'll be about this thick around, straight up and down. You have to prune throughout the season to keep them going straight up and down. But if you were to just pass by it, it's not like a fancy looking, it's just kind of like some shrub. So yeah. No, there are parts of China that have it. There are species that are more native. There are certain species, and so there is one that's native to Japan. But they were actually, I think they were mostly brought from Southeast Asia, and then they changed and developed over time. And at this point, they've been kind of interbred so much, it really doesn't matter. It's hard to tell the difference. But there were some slight differences, and they would notice that in Japan, like the, Brucinetia papyrifera versus Brucinetia kazunoki versus Campiferi, and so they're all a little different, but it would be something that only the people harvesting and making the paper probably would notice. Yeah. Yes. So that same plant? Yeah. So Imai-san, who has that huge field, he said that field is 30 years old. Some plants are 24 years old. Usually, the way we've always been taught is that after 20 years, the yield is not so good. He thinks, he believes, and based on his experience there, if you take good care of them, they go much longer than 20 years. But usually you do root cuttings. It's harder to grow this plant from seed. So you do a root cutting, and then you let it grow for 3 years, and then cut it down. And you can't really use that for paper making. It's too tough. After you cut it down that 3rd year, every year you're going to cut down. Thank you. And help, take a look at the samples and